So thank you all for joining us. Welcome. My name is Karen Goldner. I'm Managing Director of Established Business Services at the Women's Business Development Center. And we're so excited to have this amazing panel and to have you all joining us for the first of our three-part series on succession planning called The Show Goes On. Today will be well, I don't even want to say exactly an overview because we'll be talking about a large number of topics, but we've got some real experts here, and that's exciting. We will probably not do breakout rooms at the end of this. We'll just have some robust Q&A, and so this program will go until about 3 o'clock Central Time. Then next week, at the same time, we're having a special program on ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, and that will be a deep dive into that very complex and important topic. And then the third week, we're going to be talking about the ramifications for WBE certification, maybe certification more generally, and then also looking at some insurance products that can be useful for you to think about. So what I'd like to do is start this off by turning it over to Laura Redmond. She is the Manager of Transaction Advisory Services for one of our really valued partners up in the Twin Cities, EisnerAmper. So Laura, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Karen, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session titled Planning for the Long-Term Sustainability of Your Business. And as Karen mentioned, it's session number 1 out of a series called The Show Goes On, Business Succession Planning. Again, I'm Laura Redmond. I'm a CPA and manager within the transaction advisory practice at EisnerAmper, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. We have an exciting and informative session planned, focusing on providing you with a comprehensive introduction to various options for exiting your business and obtaining liquidity. Our goal is to equip you with valuable insights to help you make informed decisions about your company's future. Let me quickly outline our agenda for today. First, we'll explore a high-level overview of the major options available for ownership transition. We'll cover both internal options, such as selling to management, implementing an employee stock ownership plan, or transitioning to a family member, as well as external options like selling to a strategic buyer, an unrelated buyer, or private equity firms. Next, we'll delve into some general issues that need to be considered when planning an exit strategy. This will include exploring personal and financial goals, understanding business valuation, assessing management strengths, examining customer diversification, and discussing financing considerations from a buyer's perspective. Finally, we'll touch on the importance of working with advisors and ensuring tax efficiency throughout the process. We have a panel of experts here today to guide us through these topics and answer your questions. I encourage you to actively participate and engage in the discussion. We'll have a Q&A session towards the end, but feel free to raise your hand if you have any pressing questions during the presentation. Without further ado, let's have our panelists introduce themselves, and then we will dive onto our first topic, the major options for ownership transition. All right, I see Derek next on my screen here. Derek, would you like to introduce yourself?
Perfect. Yes. Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. Derek Dockendorf, tax manager here at EisnerAmper. My focus is primarily on the individual side, helping with tax compliance, strategy, including estate planning, charitable planning, looking at that whole income tax perspective. So really come in as part of these transactions, helping business owners transition into that next phase of life, right? After they're out of that sale of that business, what's going to look forward from that perspective and some things we should be considering. Caitlin, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Caitlin Skopek, thank you all for joining, and hope you all are having a good afternoon and excited to talk about this lively topic. I am from BMO. I am in our corporate advisory group. I serve as a director of corporate advisory for the Western United States. I help business owners with a range of corporate finance issues, but along the lines of helping you think about how to grow your business, either through organic or inorganic growth, or helping you think about transitioning your business or selling your business, whether that be internal or external sales. And I'm excited to talk to you all today and learn more about what you guys are facing. And I will turn it over to Corey.
Hello, I'm Corey Markle. I'm a partner at Eisner Amper in our transaction advisory services group. So I work on everything M&A, work with a lot of family-owned companies, private equity funds, family offices, other institutional investors. And, our primary focus here at Eisner in my group is really focused on, buying and selling companies, and look forward to, answering your questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Mani-Vasiger. I'm a lawyer at Frederickson and Byron in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I head up our business and tax group here at Frederickson, which means we work with all privately held, mostly closely held, and family-owned businesses. Start up, shut down, thrive, and sell themselves, and buy them, and buy other businesses as well. So lots of restructurings and other types of work that we do here at Frederickson. And I'm happy to be here with you today.
All right, thank you, everyone. Let's start with the first topic on why a business may consider selling. And who would like to speak on that?
I'll go first, I guess. A lot of the transactions that we work on are really family-owned companies, and at some point, especially in this world today, these companies reach a point where they don't have a succession plan, really, either with a family member or someone else they can, potentially take that over with. So oftentimes I wouldn't say forced to, but with a lack of options, oftentimes they're coming to M&A experts like ourselves to figure out what's the next best solution for that. Many times that's a sale to a competitor. It could be to a private equity fund or some other kind of strategic. But most often, once they reach us, it's typically because they don't have a succession plan ready, with a family member. Caitlin, Jessica, Derek, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I am happy to add, agree with you, Corey. And a lot of what we hear from our clients is, I don't know what I want to do, but I know I want to do something. And so we really do start with the why. Why do you want to do something? Is it a personal reason, which I think Derek can talk to a lot of the different personal sides of what might be driving you? Or is it a company reason? Is there something going on within the company that is driving you to need to make a decision or transition the business or maybe get some liquidity out of the business? So we really start with the why. Why do you feel like you need to do something? Then move into priorities. So what are your priorities? What are the business's priorities? Are you, looking for max valuation? Are you looking to keep some control? Are you looking to keep a certain legacy component to it? Is it timing? Do you want to exit today or in the future? So a lot of different ways that you could start to think about the priorities for, what you want to do with your business. And then behind that is then the options and evaluating the options. And the sooner you start that planning process, the more options you have on the table. And I think a lot of people are misled on there's only a couple options out there for transitioning your business. No, it's actually the opposite. There's so many ways you can do this. It's almost overwhelming, which is why I think a lot of us are here today. Is there's so many ways to skin the cat. What's the best way? And entrepreneurs of all people are like, let's optimize. I want the ultimate of all these priorities, and I need to, do all this planning work. That's the beauty of it, and that's why all of us as advisors have jobs, as we get to come out here and talk about what are the options and how do you start to think about it. So Derek, you drive a lot of the why on the personal side, and half the time my clients come to us because they've had client, discussions with someone like you, and the why is around estate planning and thinking about their own liquidity. So maybe I'll toss it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. Yeah, it's such a great point. And it's obviously all business owners have the idea. They see something in the market that's led them to being an owner, right? And they put a lot of heart, a lot of soul, a lot of sweat into building what that brand's going to be. At the same time, we really should be thinking and putting as much effort into how am I going to get out of this business at some point in time in the future, right? So just as we're thinking about starting this thing up, we should really be thinking about that exit strategy, because Caitlin was spot on that the longer our runway, the more options that we have on the table. If you come to any one of us and say, hey, I want to sell in the next 6 months, we're going to be pretty tied pretty quick on what we're going to be able to do with that. And one thing to kind of keep in mind is 100% of business owners one day won't be, right? Whether that's voluntary or involuntary, right? So let's plan on the voluntary side. Let's figure out all the options that are going to be there. Let's figure out what are the things that are in front of us that we can take take advantage of or really look to optimize. Oftentimes tax or financial is a major driver, but I think Caitlin touched on a couple of really good points that are important. Like, what are the legacies? Are you thinking about your employees? What is that legacy going to look like? How do you want to leave your mark in your community? Like, oftentimes the non-tax reasons are big drivers into why someone might move forward with a particular transaction or not. And if we don't spend time kind of diving through and analyzing those pieces, I've had a lot of owners that have just looked at solely the financial component, that when push comes to shove and they got to sign on that dotted line, all of a sudden they got cold feet because they're not quite sure what that's going to look like afterwards. So as much as we all think it's about the dollars and the cents and the bottom line, it's extremely important to be looking at all those things, but we've got to make sure we're looking at the non-tax reasons. Why did we look to start this business, and what kind of legacy, and why are we looking to get out from this in the future? So, and we can kind of go into all kinds of things here as we go throughout the conversation, but I think it's a really important thing to make sure that we're looking at, is also thinking about what else is up, what's important to me that I want to leave besides the monetary aspect that's going to be there. Jessica, anything else kind of on your side that you see as advising clients?
Yeah, all great points. I'll just add a couple that I see quite a bit in my practice, and that is the unexpected sale. So, for example, say you're plugging along in your business, and all of a sudden a competitor comes and wants to acquire you, and it's something that just came out of left field, and they want to move quickly. To Derek's point and Caitlin's point, being kind of prepared for that unexpected opportunity, because oftentimes they move so quickly, you don't have time to do all the things that you wish you would have done prior to this opportunity presenting itself. And I would say too, getting your ducks in a row, right? So I oftentimes when these unexpected sales come up, or even not unexpected sales, but as something I'm sure that Corey sees quite a bit with working with family businesses, is there, where's the corporate record book? Has anybody looked at it since we formed the corporation? Do we even have shares of stock? And getting all your kind of corporate documents in a row, and all these things that kind of aren't important until you do need to sell your company. And at that point, you don't want to be dealing with all of that other things while you're still trying to run it and sell it at the same time. So,
Jessica, I love that. And I might add something that I heard as a piece of advice for an owner. It's so hard, especially on the smaller side where you have thin teams, right, of these businesses, and everybody's wearing 7 hats. And somebody said it's really important that at least once a month you put on the hat as a business owner of not working in the business, but working on the business. And ideally that's a lot more, but even if that's one day a month of working on your strategic plan, working on, the option analysis, your estate plan, all those things, that makes a dent over time, right? And so if you can set aside dedicated time to working on the business versus in the business, yes, we're all busy, especially women who have families and businesses and their own lives. That's a hard thing to do. I have 2 kids under 2, I get it, but it's super crucial when it comes to the back end. And it can impact your value and all sorts of other things so greatly. So I just wanted to add to that great point.
great point.
All right, thank you all for talking about the why on selling. Let's move on to the what, and what are the ways to do a successful transition, whether that's internal or external. Touching on timeline and who to get involved, what professionals you should be reaching out to, and things you should be doing in advance. Do we want to start with the same speakers? Want to start with Corey?
Yeah, I mean, I think Caitlin, Jessica, and Derek, there's a dozen different ways to transition your business. Oftentimes with smaller owned businesses, finding an employee inside or employees inside are a great way to transition your business. There tends to be a lack of liquidity for smaller businesses out there with maybe more what I use sector options with private equity or family offices or institutional investors. They tend not to count in the lower middle markets. So for smaller businesses, employees, finding family members are great to do that through recapitalizations or giving them profits interest or capital interest, or just different ways that you can slowly transition this thing. The key is getting ahead of it. I think I think it was Derek that touched base on, hey, if you got 6 months to do something with this business, it's typically not a lot of time to figure that out. So you should be planning 2, 3, 4 years ahead of time what that's going to look like. Speaking with Caitlin and Jessica on options and figuring out what that looks like financially for you, legally for you, and then, obviously down the road, what it looks like from a state planning perspective as well. Jessica?
Yeah, I would say just kind of thinking about internal versus external, and Corey touched on this, and I'm sure he sees it too, with family businesses specifically, is the idea of transitioning to the next generation and all the very ways that you can do that and what the next generation really is, right? It might not be your kids, it might be nieces and nephews, cousins, might be horizontal transitions to brothers and sisters. And I just want to mention one thing kind of from a long-term planning perspective for those types of businesses specifically is gifting. Gifting is something that needs to happen from a tax perspective. I'm sure Derek can talk about this. It needs to happen over a long period of time to be able to take advantage of the tax benefits of gifting small amounts in the exclusion amount. And so again, like the family businesses have that option, but it takes time to do it correctly. Another internal one is, as Corey mentioned, employees of the business, and transitioning to an employee who's not a family member but works really hard and wants to acquire the business from you. There's lots of ways to do that. And then outside, right? Your PEs, your institutional institutional firms, but then also competitors. I see a lot, especially in closely held businesses. There's in certain industries, there's so much consolidation that competitors are often the acquirers. And again, that can be a great way to transition to someone who knows what they're doing, right? And get liquidity at that point. So I'll stop and transition over to Caitlin or Derek.
Yeah, I can jump in real quick on that. So one thing that as part of this process, right, where we're trying to get ahead of it with business owners out there looking at this, especially on the individual side, right, we're trying to figure out how can we help to monetize all the hard work that you put into running that business and building it to what it is, right? Whether it's an internal sale or an external sale, right? And it's a really important process to really kind of figure out, like, what do we sort of need to have at the end of the day when we walk away from this business, from cash flow, net worth, whatever it's going to be, right? And sort of like looking at our current balance sheet today, because oftentimes with business owners that we all typically work with, if they're closely held family-owned businesses, if I'm looking at somebody's net worth statement, that business is going to be the vast majority of it, right? 70, 80, 90% of their overall net worth, right? So we're trying to figure out, how do we monetize that? And sort of what do you actually need at the end of the day? What would you need to walk away today to be able to live the lifestyle that you want to? And then do we have a gap between those two, right? Do we have a gap in the value of the business compared to a gap to what I'm going to need in the future? Because all that goes into like what Jessica was saying, like what Corey was saying is like, if it's an internal side, we might get a lower valuation, or we're going to leverage gifting. All phenomenal ideas, all great things we can utilize, but where's that cash flow going to come from? We want to make sure you as the owner is going to be taken care of at the end of the day and can leverage those strategies as much as possible. And something else, like Caitlin was kind of saying earlier about her comment with, oh gosh, I forget how you said it, but like with business owners, we're so busy working in the business that it's hard to kind of take that step back and look at it from that holistic perspective. I've had a lot of conversations with owners with the same thing when they want to have their kids in the business, right? And understand there's a difference between ownership and leadership, and they may not be the same thing. Our kids may have the actual ownership of that business, but you might have somebody on a leadership team that you really want to help to make sure that they're being taken care of. So you can see how all these things, as we're going through these various topics, really all play together. And I think the main theme that you're going to hear throughout all this is the longer our runway, the more options and the more the time we're going to have to kind of turn over these stones and figure out what's going to be really most advantageous for you.
Well, I feel like you guys all covered the bulk of that topic, but then all of us could spend all day talking about that topic. So maybe I'll touch on just a couple things here. So to the point of the options out there to sell your business, like I said before, lots of different ways. I don't even say sell your business, because if it's internal, I say transition your business. If it's external, sell. Lots of different ways. Often I hear, I want to start thinking about those options. We do those priorities. We start to put those options together. And then to Jessica's point, you get an LOI, right? Things just happen. And so what I can always say is being prepared helps, right? So I had a customer who received an LOI. They didn't even know their own value. To Jessica's point, they didn't know where their buy, sell, all their agreements, they didn't know anything, right? Honestly, they were just kind of like, we got a huge dollar amount here and we want to take it. And through the work of putting the valuation together and thinking about the strategy and what they actually cared about in this exit, they said, actually, we want to evaluate selling to our management team, to our entire employee base, and to this third party. And we want to see what the 3 different scenarios might look like, both for us personally, but also for the company. And so really having a small group of advisors, it doesn't have to be all your advisors, that you can work with through these types of situations is important. So I'm going to touch on kind of what I think is the right timing for advisors. As early as possible. Obviously, we all love to be engaged early as possible, but you don't need to hire an investment bank 5 years before you're doing a transaction if you want to take your company to the market. What I would say is you can always have conversations. There's a lot of free advice out there. There's a lot of people who will meet with you and give you strategic free advice up front. And then when you're ready to transact, they hope that you call them. So utilize that, get input from advisors. I say, obviously on the personal side as early as possible, but between that 3 to 5 year mark, you need to be doing all of your personal estate planning. You should be getting your corporate tax planning in place. You should have a strategic plan. You should start documenting things, like doing all the check marks to build your value, to make sure you have customer contracts, like all those things. If you're thinking about, transitioning the business, that's also the time frame to be hiring a good management team, so there's less key man risk. And that means making sure that when you sell the business, you're not selling you, right? Because you want to have the flexibility to potentially be detached from the business, and so do the new buyers of the business. So making sure your management team is in place, making sure your financial statements start to get clean. So that's around that 3 year mark. Hiring a good CPA firm, making sure that they know what your plans are and that you're trying to transition the business or sell the business, and you need to clean up the financial statements and the balance sheet. So doing a lot of that. I always talk to your bank because they're your capital provider. And so they're also, probably willing to give you advice on the right capital structure, help you think about capital options out there, and then also give you a good lens of what people are looking for from the buy side. And then when you're closer to a transaction, 2 years out, that's when you really need to have that tight team. And I saw this advisor or this company do something interesting. Every year, he brings together all of his advisors, his personal and his corporate advisors, for a dinner. And he makes them all come to one room and he tells them all about the business, gives them all the update, talks about what he's trying to do, and then opens the floor so that everybody's on the same page. They're all connected. They're all talking together to help transact. And so then that way advisors aren't bumping into each other on plans. And so I thought that was really cool because I don't think that happens often. And it's a good way to sync everybody up to make sure that we're all helping achieve that vision. So those are kind of the timeline of advisors. We typically recommend, we see obviously there's different cases for everything out there, but something that is kind of on the standard track. But we have a lot of advisors on the call here too. So lawyers, accountants, please correct me if I'm wrong on that.
All right, great. Thanks for that, Caitlin. I think that a lot of business owners, when they think of needing to transition or sell their business, they think that a valuation is a necessity. Can you speak on when is a valuation actually necessary?
Yeah, I'll start that off. Yeah, I'm a believer in valuations. I'm actually a due diligence guy, so most of what I do actually is really actually doing due diligence on family-owned companies is what I focus on. Let's just start before evaluation actually, and I think we've kind of touched on this topic a little bit, but I don't think it's been stressed enough that half of my job is just organization, getting documents together, organizing them, making sense of the information and the data. From a financial accounting and transaction perspective, I think Jessica probably has the same issue on the legal side. And she touched on that earlier about, your legal documents, like buy and sell agreements. What does the operative agreements look like? I mean, that's half the battle before you even get to evaluation. And that can be very time consuming. And what I see a lot of is companies who are organized, who have those documents in place, can speak to the business actually get a premium for the valuation than the companies out there that tend to run a little bit more loose, don't have their organization documents in order, financials aren't cleaned up, haven't done a Q of E if you're a large enough firm or a company. So there's a number of things that I think can be done before evaluation. Honestly, and I hate to say this, you can get valuations anywhere. I mean, if you're thinking about using a broker or investment bank, a lot of times they'll give you free valuations, right? They'll look at the business, they'll put together a deck, try to have a sense of what the value of the business is, and then obviously they can give you an idea of the range of that. So yeah, I think you can get a valuation. I think there's steps before that though that need to happen before you actually start going down that road of talking with an advisor on that piece.
Yeah, I would agree. I also think it depends on your industry somewhat. Some businesses are easier to do a traditional valuation on than other businesses, just because there's comparable data out there to really get to the true value of what your business is or has. And I would also say too, if you engage any valuation firm, right, aside from maybe an accountant doing it or someone who's not a valuation firm, they are going to need, to Corey's point, a lot of information from your controller, from all sorts of, they'll come in obviously to the business if applicable to do the valuation. And it's expensive, or it can be expensive. It's not necessarily expensive. So I guess you want to know if you really need it or not. First, depending again on your industry, and are you really prepared for it? I find a lot with deals that I do, you come to a negotiated purchase price without a valuation, or again, to the point of, we've been talking about, it takes a long time maybe to do some deals, or you're preparing to do a deal. When do you do the valuation? If you do it too early, it's going to be stale by the time you're going to sell the business. So, is it worth it at that point in time to do a valuation? So, again, there's just lots of factors to consider whether you even need it or not. So, Derek or Caitlin, your thoughts?
Yeah, one thing, just kind of on the other side, on the internal side, right? You're talking earlier, Jessica, on the gifting aspect, right? If we have clients that are looking to gift part of a business interest to their kids, key employee, whoever it might be, right? We're going to want to have that valuation done to report it on that gift tax return, right? We want to understand what that value is to figure out, with the various strategies that we have, how do we most efficiently and effectively transfer that interest to that individual? And oftentimes, if you're giving less than a controlling interest, there's discounts that we can leverage, right? So we might be able to take a discount on that overall valuation and move more interest or more units out to that particular individual. So again, like that's kind of where it goes back to, who are we looking at to target to be part of this next transition? Internally, we might look at getting evaluation done for a number of different reasons, and that timing might be different than it's going to be from an external perspective. So that is something on the estate side, as we're really digesting and really looking at who we want to get this to and how we want to leverage it. That valuation on the internal piece, we might need it sooner to help complete that gifting strategy.
Yeah, Derek, that's fantastic. We've seen a lot of different businesses from the internal side have their own valuation strategies in-house, right? And how they look at their shares, and then they set up, different things. And so there's a lot of support out there for that. I call that more of the informal valuation work versus a formal valuation. And the one thing about going to the formal valuation is you do, to Corey's point, really want to know where you're going with it, because it's expensive, but also it could box you in some ways, especially in the ESOP category. So if you are thinking about selling your firm to an ESOP and you do a valuation, that will be considered in the final transaction, whether it was done 3 years, 2 years, 1 year, or at the time. So something to be cognizant of. We see that happen a lot, where folks do a valuation, then they do very, very well, and then that valuation is kind of a watermark. So just putting that on the radar. I would say, having some kind of value metrics of your business in your strategic plan is really important too, especially if you're going to sell externally, but even if you're going to pass it to your management team or your family or someone internally in the employee base. I think it's really crucial to have a 5-year strategic plan. Where's your business today? Where do you think the value is? Where are your, investments? Either is it hold steady, organic, inorganic, new products, whatever it might be. How are you going to achieve it? And then some documentation of how you've actually achieved it, because showing that you can do that, even if it's just internal, that's helpful for everybody involved. But if it's external, is super valuable in the value drivers of the third party market. If private equity or whoever it might be is coming in, or a strategic buyer, they can say, oh, wow, look at this strategic plan. They had growth goals, they hit it. That's a lot easier story than we're just putting together growth goals now and we don't believe them. And so that's part of, I think, the strategic plan is coming to a cognizant value ahead of time, and then working your way and keeping tabs on that through time. And then to Derek's point, obviously, it's important to have an understanding of that if you're doing gifting.
Thanks, Caitlin. And can you also touch on the types of buyers that are in the marketplace and how they finance?
Yeah, sure. So lots of different buyers. Like I said, there's lots of ways to transition or sell your business. Whether those buyers actually be your management team, because you could sell it to your business and it's within your own business today, the employees, the management team. It could be a strategic buyer. So when we say strategic buyer, we mean another company in either your industry or similar industry. So not a financial buyer. And so strategic buyers typically are buying you for a reason. Hopefully that reason is to help your business, grow your business, not shut down your business. But more often than not, it is growth reasons. And so a strategic buyer would come in, ideally look to keep you on board, your team on board for a period of time, if not forever, and really help you grow your platform and that business to be a part of the broader strategic. And so that's their version of growth is M&A. So they finance different ways, but most often through debt and some form of equity. A lot of times the strategic buyer will put in things for you to meet called earnouts, or sometimes seller notes, or rollover equity. And so there's different ways that they can offer you payment in an LOI. So if I'm a buyer, I could say, hey, I'll pay 100% cash for you. But more often than not, strategic buyers are going to say, we'll pay some version of cash, but then the rest is going to be things that we need to see of this business or of you for you to earn the rest of the value that we're offering you. And so those are called earnouts, or potentially some rollover equity in the broader business. So there's different ways that it can be financed, and there's different timelines that you could be acquired over a strategic. Financial buyers are very similar. More often than not, they're using debt as a bigger portion of the capital, and more often than not, their cash percentages are higher in transactions. So they're going to give you a little more cash up front, but a lot of that is financed with debt, and there's clawbacks and other things involved. So that's kind of two of the main areas. The other way, and if it is internal, are usually we see as seller notes, right? And so that's selling your business over time to your employees or to a management team or a family member. So there's ways to do that too. Corey, this is your world too. So I and Derek, feel free to add in there.
The only thing I was going to jump in real quick before I hand it over to Corey, right, is like the importance of, like Kayla was saying, having your advisor team there, especially on the tax side, right, is like helping us understand what are all these different milestones or benchmarks or ways that you're going to be paid for this business, right? Because then we can effectively plan for what are those tax required payments that we're going to have, right? How much tax are we going to owe on these things? Am I rolling over equity that I'm going to continue to defer that gain recognition? Is it a seller note that I'm only picking up capital gain or income as that note's being paid down? So it's really important as you're looking at these structures, considering the LOIs, that we're looking at that all the way through that individual aspect, so you truly understand sort of what the tax impact of that's going to be and sort of what are you going to net at the end of the day. Just wanted to kind of throw that in real quick. So Corey, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I'm going to tie back valuation though to what Caitlin and Derek are talking to, and make a couple of distinctions. One is an estate planning valuation can be very different than a valuation for a market. So you need to understand there's differences there. And we're not going to get into the nuances here, but just understand that can be very different goals. Number two is, depending on your type of buyer, it can really drive different valuation. Most times strategics are often paying a premium because there's synergies there, right? So a valuation from a strategic can look very different than an institutional investor for a number of reasons. Typically because you're acquiring you as a platform or some other initial investment where there may not be a lot of initial synergies. Maybe those synergies come in the back and later on as an add-on. So I don't have a lot to add to the types of buyers out there. I think Caitlin just touched on them, but I think Jessica's perspective a little bit on what she sees with institutional and internal sales from a legal perspective will give some insight.
Yeah, can I just I hate to go back to the valuation again, but maybe a bit even a finer point on what Corey was just saying is oftentimes, and I'm generalizing here, and Derek's probably going to start rolling his eyes when I say this, but from an estate planning perspective, you want a low valuation, and if you're going to sell your company, you want a high valuation. So again, like if you go out and get one for estate planning purposes, you're going to want to think about if you're going to sell your company later on, is that old estate planning valuation going to hurt me in some way in the sale, especially if buyer asks you for that in the due diligence process. So again, thinking about what you're trying to do with the valuation before you do it is really important. On buyers in the marketplace, yeah, it is all over the map. Again, I see a lot of kind of competitors because many of the industries that I work in, have consolidation happening, or it's in the private equity area where, again, it's kind of consolidation to form a platform of similar businesses. You may have a buyer out there who's kind of gobbling up all the businesses in one industry. So think about that, though, because that may be a way to exit that makes a lot of sense and will continue the business beyond your sale. So.
Jessica, one thing that just made me think of as we're talking about that is, especially in the strategic space, and I imagine especially for smaller businesses here, as you're seeing consolidation in your industry through private equity or through, family offices or whatever, the roll-ups of the big corporations, there are a lot of ways to combat that if you are trying to stay within your business. There's a lot of joint venture ideas. There's a lot of things that can be done. So think creatively, like women are creative. I'm going out there and saying that, like, think creatively, evaluate lots of options. Don't feel, bullied into being told, hey, this is the only thing out there for me. I have to sell because private equity is giving me this offer and I'll never see this offer again. Like, there's lots that could be worked out. So just make sure you just talk to your advisors about what you really want, and hopefully folks can help you achieve that.
Yeah, great point, Caitlin. I'm sure Corey, you probably see this a lot with family businesses. I go to family business meetings a lot where lots of family businesses talk about being a family business, and they're very proud that they have not succumbed
Yes.
to selling their business to and outside of the family. And again, there's a reason for that. There's a lot of pride and in the ownership and the succession of the business through generations. And you're right, there are options other than selling out, as they might put it, to someone who's not a family member or close to the business. So yeah.
Yeah, we see that in ESOPs a lot. So join us next week if you're curious about that topic in ESOP.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Jessica, can you touch on the difference between an asset sale and a share sale? And what are your recommendations on when to pursue an asset sale or a share sale?
Sure. So I'll just briefly cover the tax angle of it because, again, we've got others who work more closely on the tax structuring maybe than I do on deals. So oftentimes, if you have a business, you're presented with the choice or the question of whether to sell the assets of the business or your ownership in the business. And like I mentioned, there are different tax consequences for one versus the other, both for the seller and for the buyer. And oftentimes, again, it's a very generalized statement here, but oftentimes as the seller, and it kind of depends on the entity type that you are as well. So putting that in the mix, because that can complicate things as well. As the seller, you want to sell your ownership in the business to produce capital gain income versus ordinary income. You might be able to produce capital gain income anyway if you sell the assets. But again, very generalized statement, as an owner and a seller, you want to sell your ownership. But oftentimes buyers want to buy assets of the business. And there are, again, ways to do this depending on your entity type so that the buyer ends up in the same position in either way. So, so again, there's tax consequences for doing it on both sides. And again, even though you may have your preferred way to do it, the buyer will also have their preferred way. Other things to think about that may require an ownership sale or may push heavily in the direction of an ownership versus an asset sale is if you are in an industry that has regulatory approvals that you can't transfer in an asset sale. They have to stay in the business, and the business itself needs to be transferred. Now, keep in mind, those regulatory approvals may nevertheless require some approval of that regulatory agency, even to transfer the ownership, but it usually is easier. Again, super generalized statement because each industry's got their own regulatory framework. So again, that may though push you in a direction of ownership change versus asset. The other thing would be if the business has contracts. Many times contracts have anti-assignment clauses in them. And you can look at the contracts and see, you can't assign this contract without the other contracting party's consent. And there may be reasons why you don't want to go get their consent. It may be difficult to get it. They may try to renegotiate the contract with you in exchange for that consent. So you may, and oftentimes, again, generalizing, contracts may not have a provision that says you can't change the ownership of the business. So we'd want to transfer the ownership to avoid having to get permission to assign those contracts in the deal. One thing I want to mention that is specific to women-owned businesses is the women-owned business certification. Now, there's different certification agencies out there, right? And what they require. Obviously, if you transfer your women-owned business to a non-women-owned business, you're going to presumably lose that certification unless you do some structuring around that. That may affect the contracts in your business if you did that. So just be aware of, what your contracts require, if it's contingent upon you having women-owned business certification, and ways to deal with that potential loss of that status if in fact you are transferring to someone who is not, not going to be able to maintain that certification. So I'll stop there and let who wants to go next?
I was actually going to fire a question back at you, Jessica, right?
yeah,
So
sure.
if you've got someone that's looking at or trying to analyze between a share sale and an asset sale, do you tend to find that there's a difference in the potential value that you might be getting in either scenario based off the tax consequences?
Yes, it could. It could produce that result where okay, I don't know, maybe everybody can see your note,
Yeah.
Karen. The note popped up on the screen. We have a lot of details on the certification and the third session. I'll put that up there. But yes, it can matter. Obviously, if the buyer is going to be able to take depreciation on the assets that it's acquiring versus not, it's going to take it into consideration when it's when it's going to tell you how much they're going to pay you, right? So again, like the tax benefits that the buyer may or may not be able to realize may affect the purchase price. So again, going back to the tax structuring on deals is something you want to do early and figure out what your options are, especially if you're in that LOI stage, because oftentimes that LOI stage or your term sheet stage before the documents actually start getting drafted is going to be when you decide what that structure is and negotiate with the buyer. And there's not a lot of room for deviation from that structure in your term sheet or LOI, even though it says it's non-binding, is once you've kind of traveled down the path of we're going to do this structure, that's kind of what you're stuck with if you want to keep going in the transaction. So.
Yeah. And like we've seen it too, where we've had potential options like that, working with buyers very early on in the stage, right? Where you're sort of analyzing both scenarios, right? Looking at from the seller's perspective, what's the overall tax impact? Because like Jessica was saying, if it's a share sale, That's what all sellers want to have, because we get long-term capital gain treatment on that, right? So we get much more favorable tax rates. Where if it's an asset sale and we've taken a lot of depreciation, or depending upon what everything looks like, there could be a lot of ordinary income. So then there's a pretty good gap between those two tax rates. So sometimes helping to analyze what is the net tax result under both scenarios might help you kind of bridge that gap and find a price that works on both sides, right? Allows the buyer to maybe give some concessions, maybe a little bit higher sale price, so they can have, again, works out for them later on, higher base that they can then depreciate. But you might be able to help, offset some of the tax costs for the seller. So it is really important early on to figure out what route are we going. And I think you brought up some very valid points. Our hands may be tied. We might only be able to do one structure or the other, but it's good to understand from that tax side, if there's some negotiation, what's the difference between those two?
Great point.
Thank you, Derek. And continuing on that, besides, so from the seller's perspective, besides thinking through capital gains or ordinary income, are there other tax implications they should be considering?
I mean, that's the big thing that we look at from the seller's perspective, is sort of like, what is the form, right? How is this sale going to take place? And we're looking at actually what is being sold at the end of the day. And that's going to help us really kind of dissect those pieces to figure out what portion do we have that's going to be treated as long-term capital gain. Is there some goodwill in there that we can get some preferential benefit for? Is it assets? Is it the building? You got to try to figure out, like, what are all the components that are going to make up this sale in that given structure. And then even if you're on the buy side, right? Again, you're trying to figure out, like, what am I stepping into? What additional depreciation might I be able to get if I'm buying the fixed assets, the machinery, all the things that are part of this business, or some of the hard assets that I could actually take away out of this transaction. I can maybe get a second bite of the apple and redepreciate those, right? So I may be paying a little bit more on my purchase price, but I know I'm going to get a future tax benefit on some of that sale price as well. So that's the biggest category when we look at this with business owners as they're going through it, is like, we want to try to break down the components so we can see how much is going to fit into each of those buckets. What is going to be ordinary, what's going to be capital, and obviously we want to try to lift up the capital side as much as possible, because that's going to have a much more favorable tax treatment to the seller at that point in time.
I want to just mention one more thing, because I totally forgot to say it right at the beginning. This is why buyers want to buy assets, other than the tax reason, and sellers want to sell ownership. If you sell an entity, right? If you sell the ownership to someone, they are going to take the whole kit and caboodle, right? They're going to take all the assets, but also all the liabilities, unless they're dealt with prior to the deal, but also all of your unknown liabilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, and you can deal with that somewhat in the purchase agreement, right? So there's, reps and warranties about what exists in the business, and you're going to be indemnifying them if there's any losses. But usually those indemnification clauses term out over time. And if something comes up later on, it's probably their problem. And some issues there may not be enough indemnification for. So again, like, if you're selling a business as a seller, you want to get rid of everything except for what you agree to keep, right? There's excluded assets or some part of the business that you're going to maintain. And I should mention there's structuring you want to do to be able to peel that off as well prior to the deal. And as a buyer, typically you want to just cherry pick and choose what assets and maybe no liabilities you want to take on, so that you know what you're getting. But there's that overlay again of, can you even do an asset deal, depending on the regulatory as well as the contracts in the selling business. So sorry, I forgot to mention that right at the beginning, and I'm like, big deal. Sorry.
It's an important part, right? Making sure, like, if they're stepping into your shoes, they want to understand what those shoes actually feel like if they're actually going to step into them, right?
Yeah.
And so, and kind of going, like, Laura, like you're saying, it's from the tax side. Like, I don't mean to be vague with the answers, but it really does kind of depend on what we're sort of looking at. So it's like, oftentimes when we're going through this strategy with clients, is like, we're illustrating, we're formatting, we're looking at all different kinds of ways that this sale could transpire, right? And that way they're just more and more informed about what that's going to look like. So really kind of have the two categories from, like, an income tax perspective that we're looking at from the seller side, but really just how do we break those pieces down?
Thank you, Derek. Go ahead, Corey.
There's one quick thing to add, and just to simplify this, everybody thinks about gross purchase price, but nobody actually talks about what's your net after tax cash flow, right? You may have two purchase price or valuations. The lower one actually might be better because you might actually have better net after cash flow. So you have to think about that from a net after tax cash flow. How much debt you're paying off? What do the escrows look like? Do they have a basket that they can tip into? There's a number of like structural things that happen that can slowly whittle away at that top line purchase price. And so it's very important to understand, and I think Jessica and Derek have talked about this, what that's going to look like in the end, because a lower offer actually might be better for you. In some instances, I'm not talking, a $10 million difference, but marginally it can make a big deal. I mean,
Yeah, great point, Corey. Because that's, on the individual side, that's what we're looking at. What's the net after tax cash that you've got? If we're looking at forecasting that out into your financial plan moving forward, so you can actually figure out, is this a good number for me? And am I going to be able to do the things that I want to post being a business owner in that next phase of my life and enjoying those things? Yep, it's a great point.
It may even oh, go ahead. Sorry, Caitlin, please. I just want to mention just a quick example. We were working with the seller of a business. They sold their business. There's not only the federal income tax implications, but state.
Yep.
And they were left with the idea of like, I wonder if we should change residency to a low income tax or no income tax state to avoid taxes here in Minnesota are quite high. 9% on that purchase price. So it's very, you have to look at that as well, and maybe do some strategizing around state income taxes as well. So.
And just like the earlier, the better with something like that, right? Because, and again, the structure is important there too, if it's assets versus
exactly.
shares. So it's like all these things, you can see how they start kind of wrapping together and everything. So that's the state aspect is very important, especially for those of us in the four borders of Minnesota, Caitlin, California too, kind of, it's steep out there as well.
It's worse. Yeah, California's got me, and as you think about all the different ways to sell your business, these are so relevant, but you see, especially even in ESOPs where tax is a huge piece of ESOP transactions, and there's a 1042 exchange, which is a capital gains deferral. You see states like California, 60% of the companies that are converting to ESOP do a deferral, whereas states like Arizona, 0. So it really is kind of individual based. It's why you got to start early, talk to your advisors, thinking about like all of those components. The other thing on Corey's point that had me thinking is when we sit down with a business owner, and this happened recently, and we're talking about all the things that are important as they go to sell their business: valuation, legacy, tax, etc. We talked about this before, Derek, but where we start often isn't where we end, right? Yeah. And I had a business owner who said, legacy is not important to me. I want the highest valuation. And through the process of kind of understanding what legacy meant, they said, oh, actually, I do care what happens to this business. And I don't like that offer because they're going to shut my business down, right? Well, okay, so legacy did matter a little bit to you. And to the point of valuation, there's a whole lot that can be done with structure, right? Say you want more money. If you're willing to take more money over time, then sometimes you can get a higher valuation over 10 years than if you just want all of that money up front. And from a tax planning perspective, that's also really important, right? Mm-hmm. Is a slower exit could be advantageous for you depending on if it's an asset or a stock sale. So once again, I think the key theme, like plan early, put it in your strategic plan, talk about what you want to achieve and what options you want to keep open, so that you're not closing any doors that you want to go through later. So yeah. A lot that can be done.
All right, thank you. Now, across each of your disciplines, and say transition or sale is on a road to great timeline, what should a seller expect in terms of pace and workload while going through a sale or transition?
I'll go first. For sure, we all have our war stories. I would say even the fastest of deals feels like you're doing 2 full-time jobs at once, oftentimes. especially in closely held businesses, but even in not, yes, especially in closely held businesses or businesses that are tightly run, you as the seller, maybe you're the president, CEO, you're running it, kind of everything, you have to keep running that business and do the deal. And maybe there's 1 or 2 employees helping you, but that's it. It's confidential until the deal's close to closing. So you can't share your grievances with anybody else in the company while you're going through basically working 2 full-time jobs at once. It is that level of workload for a seller of a business. In part 2, and I know, Corey, you said you do a lot of due diligence. That's usually one of the first phases of a transaction after the LOI or term sheet gets executed, is there's a big due diligence period where you have to produce a lot of documents. And you may get asked for documents twice or 3 times or every which way, or you're asked to create things, or again, like it's very time consuming. And it's a marathon. I guess that's the best thing that I can compare it to outside of the deal itself. So go ahead.
I'll go. I mean, it's a grind. You know, I mean, it's a 6-month to a 12-month process typically. And I've been in processes that are longer than that. Again, I do a lot of due diligence. Half of my time, and Laura actually can appreciate this, is going through data rooms and looking at documents and organizing them and lining up financials, understanding what's happening inside the financials, right? I mean, it's time consuming because we're doing work, we're going back to the business owners, asking questions, we're analyzing that, taking that in, asking more questions. And this is not just my due diligence stream on the finance side, this is happening on the legal side. This could be happening on the environmental side if you own a location. They could have engineers or operational people asking due diligence questions, right? It's nonstop. And it goes back to this: the better you're organized, the better process you're going to have. If you think you're going to sell a company in 6 months and you haven't done anything, you're in for a rude awakening, because it's going to be a really tough haul to get that done, or get that done at a valuation that you're happy with. Not to mention, we're all advisors on this call, and we get paid as well. So the longer we're involved, the more money you're going to spend on us. And
cost you more money.
more money. It's just the reality of the business. We're hourly people, right? We're billable. So it's in your best interest to get ahead of this and speak with the right people so you're prepared. Caitlin?
Yeah, you nailed it. I would say, and this actually touches on another topic that I know we're going to talk about, but when we talked about you start to figure out what you want to do and you are about to start what you're going to do, whether that be that 6-month, 12-month journey to sell your business or transition your business or whatever that is, or it could be over time, right? Even in small portions, a lot of people will sell their business over 5 years to the management team or something on those fronts. 2 really big things come to mind. One is your management team. And if you don't have a management team in place that can help you with that, it might be beneficial to either hire an internal temporary CFO, somebody who has experience there that can help you through that transaction before you're, hiring out or hiring externally, right? And having your CPA firm or whoever it might be help you through that. But take that off your plate as much as you can so that you can still run your business. Ideally, you've also reduced your role in the business unless you're staying on for a long period of time. So ideally you have a management team that you've shifted some of those responsibilities to as well. And then to communication of plan. To Corey's point, you're going to be asking your team all sorts of questions through the process. You're going to be, trying to navigate this. If you can not be alone in the process, that's ideal, right? If you can have your at least C-suite through it, that's ideal. If it's a family business and you're transitioning it to the next generation, I used to work in family business consulting. All we did was help family businesses pass to the next generation. And I'll joke, but it's very true. We had a psychologist on staff and she was the busiest person on the team. Like having a good third party in a family business transition, set up the family board, help with the communication, help with the strategy, the talent development, the leadership, the ownership, like all of those parts. If you can afford a consultant there, it's really important to have a third party communicate that and help you with that plan. But having those, advisors along the ride, along with the people internally, will make that process a lot better. It's going to suck either way. It's not a fun thing, but at the end you get money, so woohoo. But through that process, like, it's going to be difficult, and just making sure you have as many hands as you can to help you through it. It's really the best you can do. And I would say that's probably my best piece of advice is, like, if you can let your management team, in ESOPs in particular, super complex transactions, typically, you got to have your C-suite on board and understanding where you guys are going with the company. And then as far as timing to the rest of the employee base and management team and ownership, that's going to be super individual and what makes sense for you. We typically see, after a transaction is decided that that's the path you're going on, then the communication can be put in place. You don't really want to communicate it before that's kind of solidified, because sometimes that causes disruption within the business itself. So being very cognizant of that.
Yeah, great point, Caitlin. Oftentimes in transactions, employees will go along with the deal, and other times they don't. So, understanding that as well, and that sometimes will happen during the deal negotiation process, unless there's certain key employees that get mentioned, maybe in the LOI, or there's an understanding between the parties that they'll be extended offers, whereas other ones won't. But there's oftentimes a confidentiality about the deal, and it's in with a small group of people, 2, 3, 4 people at the most, usually in a closely held business. Maybe even some of the owners may need to know too, if you have passive owners in your business as well. And just figuring out who can know about the deal and making sure that they're bound by confidentiality as well. Many of your advisors are going to have that requirement anyway in their engagement with you. But again, like most deals stay confidential until the very end. So you just need to be aware of that, as well as, again, like who's going to go along, who's not, because there could be surprises there. So.
Okay, thank you. Caitlin, anything else about when the business should communicate the transition to customers and other key stakeholders?
Yeah, it kind of goes along the lines of what we were just talking about. It's so situational, and it depends on what transaction, right? If you're selling to a third party, bringing in private equity, if you're doing all these things. For example, I have a business that they brought in a minority private equity firm that's 30%. They're not telling anybody, right? That's not going to be internal or externally shared. There are some situations where you have to share it, or you want to share it, and in an ideal world, you do want to share it, right? If you're selling to your employees, if you're selling to your management team, even if you're selling to a strategic or a financial buyer that maybe has a platform that's going to be good for the business, you do want to share it with your employee base so they buy into that too. Have a strategy to it, have a communication and a rollout strategy to it if you can, because that's successful. So yeah, it's really dependent upon the situation.
Customers is another one though too, right, Caitlin?
Yes. Yes, be very strategic with that communication strategy. If it's the employees first, then it's the customers. What are you saying? How are you saying it? Is everybody on the same page? There's a big thing, and I spend a lot of time with ESOPs. That's a huge thing, right? Because it's very complex to then explain to the employees that they're the owners of this business, to your customers that your employees are now the owners of your business, and that what is happening, or even to your advisors, right? So sometimes insurance firms aren't going to understand your change of ownership, or your whoever your range of advisors are, explaining to them too, this is what we did and why we did it, and this is how it's going to benefit us. All that, the story is important.
I would also say with customers, obviously you don't want to lose any of your customers in your deal, right? Oftentimes you have to disclose to your buyer who your top customers are, and there usually is a concerted, agreed upon timing and even wording of how you communicate what to your customers, and it may depend on the contracts you have with your customers, because certain types of acquisitions may produce some customer, may cause some customers to go elsewhere because they don't want to do business with the buyer. And that could hurt you if your purchase price is dependent upon the earnout from those customers. So again, like thinking through and knowing when and how to communicate is really going to be key so you don't lose any business in the process. So
Great, thank you. Now, what considerations are there? And this question's for Derek. Now that, say, you've sold your business, now what?
Yeah, I think that's the ultimate question that a lot of owners don't necessarily want to take on, right? That business for such a long period of time has been part of their identity, right? Like, and it's a really hard transition to say, yesterday I own this business, today I don't, right? So that kind of goes back to a lot of those when we're starting with the why, like thinking about what you're going to do afterwards. What does that sort of new identity look like? Because again, I think I talked about earlier, we've had some owners that were there almost to the end of the finish line, but they weren't sure what they were going to do the next day, and ultimately didn't sign on the bottom line because they didn't take the time to sit with it and understand, what do I want to do? Am I going to be more involved in my community? Is there philanthropic intent? Maybe if I'm a serial entrepreneur, I'm going to go ahead and take this capital and roll it into the next business. There could be a number of different things that come along with it. And something else that changes, that takes a little bit of an adjustment period, is if you were drawing a wage or a guaranteed payment, looking at how you're being paid, you've just monetized this business and now hopefully have a significant sum of money that's there that is now going to be invested, put someplace else. So you're wondering, where's my cash flow going to come from, right? Is it coming from my investments? How am I going to continue to be paid moving forward? What are some of those things going to look like? So there's that adjustment period as well. And just trying to understand, and even from the income tax side, it takes a lot of my clients as we make that transition, probably 2.5 years to really feel comfortable about what that looks like. That first year gets they just feel uneasy because they're just so used to what it's been for the last 20, 30, 40 years. Now it's something brand new, right? And so like that's where we can really come in, help to ease it. We've talked about it a ton, having your advisor team around that. Like that's where if you've got a great financial advisor, you got a great plan that's there, a lot of those questions can be answered up front. So it does take a little bit of self-reflection on what you want to do post being that business owner. And I think the more time that you spend with that, amongst all the other things that you're trying to juggle, running the business, getting everything ready to go, if you can kind of spend some time with that, with family, significant others, whoever it might be, to help kind of figure out what that next phase is going to look like, I think the easier that transition is going to be when that day comes that you're on that other side.
Derek, I love that. And I read this question and I hear this question a lot. And I think all of us on the phone and everybody who owns the business is hoping that it's a positive, right? It's like, great, we're selling our business, we're gonna have a bunch of money, and I'm gonna go spend time with my kids, and I'm gonna go retire, and I'm gonna travel to Hawaii. I would say probably the bulk of the businesses I'm working with, that's not necessarily the case these days, right? We're in a different place than we were pre-COVID, and small businesses are in a different place. And so a lot of the times, especially women-owned businesses that we're talking to, they're trying to decide, like, is it worth it to just keep going with this?
Mm-hmm.
Am I going to grow it? Am I going to sell it? It's not doing well. It's in distress. What risk do I have personally in this? Like, should I sell it just because of that? Like, so when we go back to the why is not always, it's doing fantastic and I want to sell it and maximize and get out of here, right? The why might be, it's personally draining me. It's draining my personal life and my relationships and all these things going on. And I just need it out, or I need to think about a plan, or whatever it is. And so just acknowledging those that are maybe on the call that might be saying, like, well, great, I would love to sell this for a lot of money and then get out of here. There's a lot of options to make that decision too, right? So if you're trying to push this business forward, there's capital out there, there's things that can be done, there's restructuring that can be done, there's different ways to kind of navigate that. Tap your advisors, tell them what you're trying to do. Maybe it's to get to a point that you can then sell it and now you're successful. If you want to get rid of this business and you just need out, right? There's those conversations too. And maybe the now what next is, now I can go do what I need to do, even though it's not with funds. Like, even though you're not leaving with a bunch of liquidity or cash or whatever it is, you're just leaving it and your mental health is much better. So there's just a lot that can be weighed into that. And I wanted to acknowledge that a lot of the conversations I have out there are on that latter half of, I got to do something. I don't know what I want to do. I got to do something, but it's not this. And so I need this off my plate or out of my world. And so that's unfortunately some of the conversations that are had. And I just please don't let this be the last thing we talk about is the negative to it. Somebody else tie it back to the positive, but I just wanted to acknowledge that sometimes that's the case.
Well, go ahead, Corey. Yeah.
To say that, and to set expectations, very rarely can you just hand the keys over to someone else or to cut you a check and you can go on your way. You're likely going to be tied to that business regardless for at least a year or two, if not longer. So once you do sell that business, there's going to be probably some expectations that you're going to be around that business, keep it up and going. They're going to tie some, purchase price to that to make sure that you're kind of making sure that that business is going along the same way that, what do you want this for? So you're not completely out of it, but at some point you will be. And that sometimes helps that mental transition from being a business owner 100% of the time to maybe being a part-time business owner, but over time you're able to kind of transition that to the
And Corey, on that, a lot of the folks who are on the call, if you are selling to a strategic or even a financial buyer that can support you, sometimes that's the support that's needed, right? Sometimes you're not trying to sell this business all outright. You want to sell a minority piece of your business to get that financial or industry or strategic or customer base, whatever it is that you're getting out of those platforms, to then grow the business, to then sell it at a larger multiple. So there's that angle too, right? There's lots of things you could do on that path to try and solve for the problem you're facing today.
I do have I'm working with a woman-owned business right now, and she's selling, right? Actually to 2 employees. But it is a family-owned business as well. And she was jokingly saying to me, like, I need an advisor who can just help me figure out what I'm going to do next. Because the other owner is her brother. He's in Hawaii. He's got that figured out. But she's the one who actually runs the business. And when this transaction is done, yeah, she'll be in an advisory role to make sure that the business succeeds once she's gone. But the indecision or the not knowing what's next because you've spent all this time growing this business is real. Mm-hmm. And you haven't had time to think about what do I want to do next. So that's the challenge for you.
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And Karen, do we have any questions?
Well, I have some questions, and I'm going to ask a couple of these to have you talk about them, and then I'll stop the recording. So then if anybody, in the audience has a question, that wouldn't be recorded. So Corey had referenced Q of E, quality of earnings. Excuse me, can one of you talk a little bit about what that means and how, excuse me, when we say cleaning up your Q of E, what does that mean?
Yeah, so Q of E is what we call quality of earnings in the deal process. Really what it does is a third party takes your financial statements as reported and then cleans them up, pulls all the personal stuff out of there, non-recurring costs. Maybe it's carving out a business or carving out some assets or cash flows that aren't going with that business, depending on the deal structure. It's really a way for financial and accounting due diligence to kind of bring to light what the real business is going to throw off in terms of cash and EBITDA going forward on the new structure. So it happens a lot in lower middle market or smaller businesses. I'd say businesses that have 10 to a couple $100 million in revenues that maybe don't have a review or an audit, or maybe has, I don't want to call it ugliness, but a lot of noise in the financial statements that need to get pulled out. And so a buyer or investor can kind of understand, hey, what's the real cash flow available to me? They actually use that to value the company going forward. And so when we talk about valuations and when to get a valuation and when not to get a valuation, I think you're actually better off spending money on getting either like Q of E or Q of E Light or something like that, so you can really understand what the cleaned up financials look like. Because once you have that, it's pretty easy to value a company, based off multiples or some basic DCF model that you can get your hands around. It's actually probably a better use of your time. And by the way, a buyer is likely going to do a QV anyways on you. So you're going to want your own QV because you're going to have some leverage in that deal when they come back to you with all these adjustments. You want to make sure you're getting ahead of that and setting those expectations so you have something to push back on a little bit.
Thanks. And then that leads into my second question. People hear about multiples, but that term has been mentioned a few times. Can you just, multiple of what? And how does one look at what's the multiple for my business?
Multiples are all over the board right now. You see multiples as low as 2x EBITDA. I've seen multiples right now that are 16 times EBITDA or cash flow right now. So it really depends on what industry you're in, what the growth profile looks like, how mature the company is, what kind of adjustments need to get layered into that to figure out what EBITDA is. I think for the ones on the call, EBITDA stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And really what it is a cash flow number after you paid your expenses that's left over to support debt or equity distributions effectively and working capital investments. So they really try to understand what that cash flow looks like so they can value it.
And Corey, I might just add there, just on your prior point, the adjusted EBITDA, right? And so not just what your EBITDA is based off of your financial statements, because a lot to your earlier point, a lot of folks are flushing things through the income statement that maybe wouldn't be in a post for tax considerations, a post-sale dynamic. So really understanding what that EBITDA is and then what your adjusted EBITDA would be in a sale environment, really crucial as you start to think about multiples. The other thing I'm going to share, multiples have changed greatly, right? And so to your point, Corey, multiples are different in industries, different in size. Typically, you can get a higher multiple the bigger you are in your industry. So there's a scale benefit to multiples, but then also so much nuance to like how your business actually operates and where the value is. So be careful when you look at multiples and you set expectations. One thing we saw, and this came out of 2020, 2021, is multiples started to grow in a lot of industries and you got these very high multiples. And then all of a sudden as capital costs went up with interest rate environments, those multiples stayed high because the sellers were thinking, oh my gosh, this is the value of my business. And we saw less businesses trade, right? Because now the buyers have more expensive capital, that multiple really should have come down. The gap there, either the businesses don't trade, either they decide, okay, I'm not going to get this 8 times multiple, I'm not going to sell my business, or their structure. And so what we mean by structure is, how does the offering business buy this? It's usually with rollover equity, earnouts, seller notes. Those types of pieces have gotten to be bigger pieces of deals. So now we see about 60% pre-2020, 40% of businesses were sold with all cash. Now we see that is at 38%. In the middle market. And so you look at that number, then you think about what types of pieces. Earnouts are now 15% of deals in the middle market space. That's high. It was at 5%. Rollover equity, another 10 to 20% is the range. So a lot of businesses that are selling, even to third parties that maybe prior to the pandemic were selling for all cash, that has come down very significantly just in this post-COVID era. So when you say multiple, it might be 8 times, but a lot of that multiple is not being paid out for 10 years or 4 years or 5 years, whatever it is. That's the danger in kind of getting your eyes hooked on a multiple. It's much more, what is your business worth? And then how are you going to get paid and what works best for you?
Thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.